Hello and welcome to the Paddock Pass Podcast, brought to you by Renthal Street and Fly Racing. Check out renthal.com for the Fit My Bike option, and you'll be able to see all the different options you're able to have on your bike. And David Emmett joining us as ever on the Paddock Pass Podcast. He's a man that needs to do that for his new BMW. But David, Neil Morrison on the pod as well. We don't have Adam Wheeler on the pod this week. Adam's on his way back from Motocross of Nations, so he's on his way back from the US. But we do have Adam dialing in on a couple of occasions just with his notes from the weekend. But it was a big weekend of action at Motegi. And Neil, I want to come to you first, because what was probably the toughest thing for you this weekend? Was it just having to remember a new name for a circuit for one thing?
I mean, a 5 a.m. alarm, Steve, is always something that I regard with the kind of, what's the right phrase? Contempt, exactly. Yes. So I would say the 5 a.m. alarm on Sunday was easily the toughest part of the weekend. And then, I wasn't on comms duty, thankfully. So, not really remembering the exact name of the mobility circuit resort, Motegi.
Well, do you know what? I came to you first on this because I thought it would be a little bit cruel to go to David Emmett and ask him about mobility issues. But David, how are you feeling now after your injuries? You're back to full fitness?
I am
as close to full fitness as it gets.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty close to full fitness. They're just the occasional twinge, but that's completely different to 2 weeks ago where I was in extreme pain. So no, looking pretty good, really.
Can I just say?
I'll tell you what.
Sorry, just one of the highlights of my weekend. I was picking up a few bits and bobs for the trip going away to Thailand tomorrow on Tuesday, and then I'll be away for a month. So I was picking up a few little clothing items before my trip, and I was in quite a fashionable Japanese clothes store in the middle of Barcelona. And I have to say that what David is currently wearing now, there was a whole row of similar fluffy fleeces just like that. And I was thinking, wait a second, these guys really modeled this kind of entire fashion range on David Emmett? I mean, really, what is the world coming to? I know the pound is tanking, but what is the world coming to?
I mean, do you know what? I'm gonna jump in ahead of you, David, because this comes back to one of Neil's favorite films, American Psycho. David Emmett, when did you become such a stylish motherfucker?
I mean, like, considering I've been wearing sort of, grey and brown and green fleeces since probably the late 90s. I think that makes me one of the most fashionable people on earth.
I've always said it, Dave, since I very first met you.
As long as you all you need to do is keep wearing the same clothes for multiple decades, and at some point you'll be sort of at the very peak of fashion. And 10 years you'll be at the very nadir of fashion, but you just have to stick with it.
Yeah, David, you're in that full-on Grandpa Simpson moment of when something moves from being hip to scary. But you're back in style, back in fashion, and the good news is back in the podcast. We've got a lot to cover from the Mobility Resort Grand Prix of Japan. I don't know, the Motegi Grand Prix of Japan. Just because Adam's not here, we've got to still get that in. But I want to come to you first, Neil, because what was your big moment of the weekend? This was obviously a weekend where there's a lot of moments to pick from, but we saw Jack Miller win the MotoGP race, Ayagura in the Moto2 class. We had Izan Guevara take a big step towards the Moto3 World Championship. But for you, over the course of the weekend, what was the one thing that stood out?
The one thing that stood out was probably the 4:55 alarm on Sunday morning, Steve. But aside from that, I think it has to be Jack Miller's pass on both Miguel Oliveira and Marquez on the first lap of the MotoGP race. That was just a great piece of overtaking from Jack, and I think it was at that moment where we thought, this guy is really in the mood here. It's a tricky place, one of the trickiest points on the entire track. You see a lot of people running wide there, a lot of people losing the front, but Jack, I think in 3 laps passed 4 riders at that point, and went from 7th to 1st in basically the blinking of an eye. So it was a particularly sweet move from Jack, and it basically paved the way for him to go on and dominate the race. Probably his most convincing MotoGP performance to date.
Yeah, I think certainly his most convincing, especially when you look at Friday was really strong, then the wet qualifying on Saturday pushes him back down the order. And there was one moment during the race to the front for Jack where Matt Bird on comms for the world feed said that's 3 fastest laps in a row for Jack. And from that point on, we didn't really see him again. But Dave, what about you? What was your moment of the weekend?
I think my moment of the weekend was the warm-up lap for Aleix Espargaro when they showed his onboard camera and he seemed to be grabbing his helmet. And the first time he does that, you sort of think, is he trying to push his helmet on properly? But then his whole demeanor was really quite sort of a bit odd. And then we saw him pull into the pits and have to start from pit lane. And it later transpired that basically the electronics engineer, because while they're on the grid, they're connected to an engineer's laptop, and because Motegi is such an incredibly heavy track for fuel consumption, and because they're not allowed to refuel on the grid, they put in a special eco mode map, basically a fuel saving map, which doesn't allow them to go over I think 100 kilometers an hour and 5,000 RPM, just to use as little fuel as possible, exiting the pits and going around to line up on the grid. But when they got back to the grid, then the electronics engineer forgot to swap the maps back, to take the eco mode off and put the race maps back in. And so Aleix Espargaro, as soon as he left the grid, he realized he couldn't rev the bike like he wanted to. He knew at that moment that his race was lost and forgotten, and you felt incredibly sorry for it because there was absolutely nothing he could do. And he's such an expressive guy that it was when you see that, you sort of think, okay, yeah, no, this is going horribly wrong.
Yeah, and just when something like that happens, Dave, you obviously get brought back to Catalonia in the last lap for Aleix. Lost points there from his mistake. This is the team making a mistake. Obviously, it's always possible to have something happen through the course of the season, crashes, technical issues. But these were two very much unforced human errors, and they could prove very costly.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, he... to an extent, he was lucky that Fabio Quartararo only managed to finish 8th and that Pecco Bagnaia crashed out, because he's still 7 points behind Bagnaia. He didn't lose that many points. He only lost 8 points to Quartararo. So he's still in the hunt for the championship. But he did himself. The team did him absolutely no failures. He was asked also, like, is this down to tiredness? Because these flyaways, they are we were at Aragon, and then there's this rush out to Japan, and it was a weird weekend at Japan anyway. We had the shortened practice on Friday, and then completely rained off on Saturday. Apart from qualifying, we lost FP3. We had sort of a wet session in the morning, and then we lost the untimed session of practice, and qualifying was delayed for over an hour and a half, something like that. So there's all this weirdness going on, and you sort of think that drains a lot of energy from everyone there, and it's exactly the kind of thing which can provoke errors. But Espargaro said, "Look, this is our job. Of course everyone's tired, but this is our job. You have to do it. You have to get it right."
Yeah, because obviously, Neil wasn't the only one with a 5 o'clock alarm call. Even whenever you're at the circuit as engineers, mechanics, they're rolling into the circuit very early doors as well, and it can happen where mistakes crop up. It's just very costly, and it could well be costly, Neil, as well, for third in the championship for Aleix, because their points lost to Bastianini as well.
Exactly. Although Bastianini didn't have a great race either, didn't have a great weekend. Inexperience showed with 2 costly crashes at the end of Friday and the qualifying on Saturday. But I think Aleix, obviously Dave was saying, fortunate in a way, but also he was looking at that race and thinking that he could have been up there maybe fighting with Miller. He qualified ahead of Jack, and he felt that with his preferred tyre option, he felt he could have run the same time as Jack. So yeah, massive missed opportunity for Aprilia.
I said that we've got Adam on the pod dialing in as well. So let's hear from Adam on his moment of the weekend.
Hi guys. All right. Sorry I can't be with you on the pod, but I'm just travelling back from Chicago now, and I've got some very nice music in the background. of a shopping mall. Just stopped in to record these notes. Moment of the weekend for me, definitely Brad Binder's pass. Left it to the last moment to line it up. He said that, he judged it to perfection and it looked like it on the TV. A fantastic move, to equal his best result of the season. And I was a bit surprised, to be honest. I did think in the dry weather, the KTMs would struggle more compared to the competitiveness they showed in the damp. But probably Binder's best race of the year.
Thanks, Adam. I'd imagine he looked ridiculous in the middle of a shopping centre recording that, but it's much appreciated by us and by all of our listeners. I think for me, my moment of the weekend is obviously keeping abreast of GP and Superbikes for the weekend. It was seeing Honda on pole in both World SBK in MotoGP with Marquez. So for me to see Marquez come back on form, obviously it's a wet session, but this weekend showed just how strong Mark's going to be going forward. Didn't look to have any real impact from all the injuries and the surgeries. He looked really competitive. So that was good to see. Iker Lecuona taking pole position for Honda in World Superbikes. That was the first time since Buriram in 2016 from a Honda on pole. So that was really good to see both of those things happening on the same day. And certainly for Honda, they'll hope that in both classes, it's that turn that they need to be able to really come back onto form.
A question for you, Steve. Was this the first pole for the new Honda CBR 1000 RR since they redesigned it and stuck the wings on and did all the rest of it?
Yeah, it was the first pole since then. It was Van der Mark all the way back in 2016. So that was whenever they did the facelifted Fireblade that didn't really have anything different other than a fairing. So this is from that big change in bike. And I think you're going to see quite a lot of other changes to that bike going forward. Obviously, for the World SBK podcast, we're going to be talking quite a bit about some of the concession power, super concessions that have currently been introduced as well by the FIM just to help push things forward for a couple of manufacturers. So we are going to see a lot more changes for Honda. You'll expect to see them at the front of the field a little bit more regularly now as well. Lecuona in particular looks like he's doing a really good job. Xavi Vierre at the weekend looked pretty solid, but Lecuona is certainly the star man for them there. But just to take it back to Motegi and MotoGP, Neil, I'm going to come to you straight away for your big talking point of the weekend. What was the one thing that you look at and say, you know what, this is what affected the weekend most?
Well, I guess my talking point is more of a question that I would like to open up to both of you guys, and maybe I could contribute to it as well. I was wanting to know, did Jack Miller win this race because he was the fastest guy at this track, or was it the kind of circumstances that we saw through the weekend that impacted it? Obviously, strange circumstances we had. As Dave mentioned, we had completely wet Saturday. We had a truncated schedule as well because we were anticipating some freighting issues, getting everything out from Aragon to Motegi in 4 days. They were unfounded fears in the end, but basically we had an hour and 15 minutes of dry track running on Friday, 20-minute warm-up on Sunday, and that was basically the only preparation that we had. So it was strange in that you heard Brad Binder, who finished second, talking about the first 10 laps of the race, and he was still essentially coming to terms with the track because it was the first time he had been there on a MotoGP machine. I think 10 of the full-time members of the grid that were at Motegi racing on Sunday were rookies on MotoGP machinery there. And Binder was saying the best thing that happened to him was actually following his teammate Miguel Oliveira in the first couple of laps, because he got to see that his braking markers weren't perfect in some places and he was maybe hitting the wrong lines in certain points of the track. So you had this weird situation where a lot of guys were not quite fully dialed in. And it was only during the race, maybe midpoint of the race, where they started to feel, okay, this is how we ride this part of the track. Espargaro's issue as well. I think he could have maybe been up there fighting towards the front at some point on Sunday. And then maybe you had, the kind of the pressure of the championship challengers affecting Quartararo, Bagnaia, Bastianini. But yes, I guess that is my kind of question. It was a strange weekend, but do you feel Jack won this on merit? Yeah,
I think you couldn't take anything away from Jack. I think that the experience is certainly a factor as well. Motegi, you mentioned there, Neil, about riders having to figure out braking zones, one corner leading into the next. Motegi's a really tricky track for that because you want to rush into so many corners. You want to brake deep and hard into the corner, but it can put you offline for the flip-flop at the end of the lap if you're down into that 90-degree right-hander. There's a lot of corners like that where it's so easy to make a small mistake that really is compounded for the next couple of corners. So having experience not only of the track on a MotoGP bike, but with the same bike can make a big difference. And I'm not 100% sure, but Miller would have been one of the few riders that also had experience using the shapeshifter there as well from his Pramac days.
The only one.
Maybe that's a little factor. There you go. So maybe that's a little factor as well, because it's such a, riders are used to it now, but Motegi is such a busy track that maybe this was a little bit of an advantage for him as well in that Friday morning session or Friday afternoon session, the pre-practice session.
I'm not sure I agree, because I think the bikes have changed so much. The race itself was 12 seconds faster than 2019. Miller was 31 seconds faster than he was in 2019. That's a massive, massive difference. There was a lot of riders who were considerably faster. I think Oliveira was 30 seconds faster. Alicia Spargaro was 19 seconds faster, despite losing nearly 5 seconds in the first lap.
And being on the wrong rear tire.
Yeah, and being on the wrong rear tire. Yeah, exactly. There's so much has changed. I do think that the circumstances contributed a lot. I don't think it contributed. It changed Miller's victory. I think Miller won this because Miller was just, he was so much better than everyone else. Even on Friday, you could see that he really had something a little bit extra. The biggest change, I think, was the hard rear tire. No one really had time to try the hard rear tire. A few people tried it on Saturday morning warm-up. The Saturday morning warm-up was
Sunday.
Sunday warm-up. Yeah, Sunday warm-up was also a little bit later. It was 11 instead of 10. And so temperatures were a little bit high. It actually made it worthwhile trying it gave you a realistic idea of what the hard was going to be like. There were riders who didn't try the warm-up, didn't try the hard tire. Fabio Quartararo was one of them. And he regretted it. He said it was definitely the wrong tire. It would have been better it was the safe option, and he would have been better on the hard rear. I think Jorge Martin would have preferred the hard rear as well. But yeah, I mean, like in terms of victory, definitely Jack Miller completely 100% deserved this. I think it did penalise Pecco Bagnaia, because Pecco Bagnaia has to work harder to get the ideal setup, and once they find his setup, he's almost like a throwback to Valentino Rossi, where they find something on Sunday morning, and they're very much in that mode where they've got sort of a ballpark setup which works really well, but they find something through the weekend to give him that extra step, which has been allowed him to dominate. Whereas if you look at, say, Fabio Quartararo is pretty much at the maximum of what that bike is capable. They know all the ins and outs of it. They completely understand it, and there's just nothing more for them to find on the weekend. The only thing he could have found is a bit more grip with the hard rear tire, and also they said they made a change on for the race, which didn't really work out for them. Didn't specify what. But yeah, I don't think it affected the win. The fact that this was such a strange weekend, but I do think it affected the rest of the field, if you like.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you, Dave. And I would just like to clear up that when I posited that question, it may have sounded as though I was pouring some doubt on the merit of Miller's victory, but I think that was absolutely Miller's weekend in many respects. Maybe if we had normal circumstances, full free practice, dry on Saturday as well as Sunday and Friday, maybe we would have had more guys up towards the front. Maybe we would have had a closer race. But I think just the kind of confidence that he showed early on was something we haven't really seen from Jack through his time in Ducati. There's been a couple of races where he has been, the standout guy, but two of his victories have come in kind of wet conditions or rain-affected races. Then, obviously, the Jerez triumph last year was basically a consequence of Fabio Quartararo suffering serious arm pump issues. This is the first time that he was head and shoulders above the rest, and I think it's been coming really for some time now. We've kind of spoken quite a bit about the Barcelona test that came the day after that race weekend as being pivotal to Jack's season. And since then, he has been fast more or less everywhere we've gone. He had, three podiums in 4 races, crashed out of the lead at Misano, pole position at Misano as well. So he has been in some really good form. And he was saying a few weeks ago that at that test in particular, what had happened specifically was in previous years, his base setting was so different to the other Ducati riders, the likes of Bagnaia or Zarco. And when they started working with the GP22, they kind of took his base setting from previous years and went in that direction. And when they got to Barcelona, they realized, well, I guess they knew before, but they looked at what Bagnaia, Zarco, those guys were using. They thought, we're so far away from them. Let's try what they've been doing. And essentially, they kind of went back in line with the other Ducati riders, or, Bagnaia. And that sort of gave him that sort of front stability, ability to brake late. We know Jack's a seriously late breaker. That has helped him kind of recover his form, recover his speed. So yeah, I think this has been coming. I think also the fact that his future is sorted. He knows he's got a 2-year deal with KTM. He's not in the championship running, so he can just sort of be free in some respects. And I think that that was also a big contributor, and has been a contributor to his recent form. Big one coming up, obviously, 2 races from now, Phillip Island. Jack will be thinking about getting himself into best shape possible before that, because he has to go to that weekend thinking he can maybe be fighting for another victory, given that long front straight on Phillip Island. If Jack can be in the podium running there, that would be the kind of cherry on top of his time at Ducati. Like, what a brilliant way to sign off that would be if he could have another victory there.
It's a good job you did clear that up, Neil, because otherwise you would have probably been lynched on you as soon as you landed in Sydney Airport when you head over there. I think if there'd been more of a normal weekend, because Miller was just completely superior this weekend, I think what we would have seen is a different battle for second. But I don't think we would have seen I don't think anyone could have got close to Miller, because he just hit the ground running.
Yeah, I think for me, Jack's win reminded me of some of Crutchlow's wins in the past, where for that one day, he was just unbeatable. And it was a really good performance. And I think it was great to see, given the run of form he's been on, the work that's been done to try and find solutions. And now, like you said, Neil, he's found that form over the last few rounds. So that's exactly what you need to see as a factory rider.
Absolutely. I interviewed Jack a few weeks ago at Misano, and we made some interesting comments. I know we might say that we might think it's a cliche when you meet someone and you get engaged to them, that suddenly gives you a different perspective or whatever. But he was just explaining the difference that having a new partner, fiance with him when he's living in Andorra has made. He said, previously, if he had a bad result, he would go back to Andorra and he would stew in it for about 10 days. And he'd be sitting in his apartment by himself, or his house, thinking about it over and over and over again. And he said now the fact that he's, engaged, really happy with his partner, that just takes his mind off things. He's not sitting there agonizing over things that he's done wrong. It's kind of just freed him up a little bit and allowed him to be, I guess, a little less tightly wound up. So, that is another, I think, factor that has kind of contributed to Jack and this decent run that he's been on recently.
That sort of makes me think of 2015 for me to bring up that sort of bombshell. Because if you think about what
happened in 2015, Dave?
There was some racing.
Neil joined the paddock. That's
right.
That was it.
That was the big thing. But you saw at the end of that year that Valentino Rossi went home and really stewed on that on the way that championship ended. And you wonder if that sort of negative energy ate away at him and was partly to I don't know, it sort of sucks the joy of racing out from him, because he did seem like a different person after that. He really seemed a lot angrier and more bitter. I mean, completely understandably, he felt that he'd been robbed, and so I can really understand why that you would feel that way. But perhaps that sort of being, like going home and stewing on things is what went wrong. And certainly you can see in the case of Jack Miller, he really does. He's so much more relaxed.
Mention of the 2015 title fight, tick. Had to get it in, Dave.
The Paddock Pass Podcast hashtag Sepang Clash pod is back there once again. No, I have to say, Dave, it's interesting when you mentioned that about stewing on it at home, because I was talking to a few riders about their mental approach to things. And if you've made a mistake, criticize yourself. Do you think, like, oh, how did I give up that position? Or do you get angry, or do you just try and forget about it and move on? And a lot of them said that the mindset for an elite athlete is that you actually just take time to be frustrated, because that's the best way to deal with it. And then when you move on and you forget about it. And it could be where, you just have to show your frustrations for a minute. You look at someone like Aleix. How many times do you see him absolutely throwing stuff around the place, really frustrated, banging his helmet or this, that, or the other. But then when he gets back to going back out on track, he's ready for it because he's got that frustration out of himself. And it's the mentality and knowing what you have to do that makes the difference. For some riders, stewing on it isn't a good thing. Others have to move on nice and quickly. But it is a mindset thing that's always quite interesting to see how riders have to deal with things. But welcome back to the Paddock Pass Podcast, presented by Fly Racing at Renthal Street. We got some of the important details out of the way there with an ad break, but we've got much more important things to talk about now as well. Because Dave, let's come to you. What's your big talking point from the weekend?
Really, the way that Ducati are handling this championship. The fact that it was a fantastic week for Ducati. They win the race, 2 riders on the podium, but it was the wrong riders. Pecco Bagnaia finds a way to throw away 8 points, and also, more importantly, to throw away the momentum that he had. Coming off the back of 4 wins and a second place. Enea Bastianini sort of scores a point, but loses out a little bit. It really feels like Ducati are desperate to win a riders' championship. I mean, we talked about this on the last pod, that you could really see by the reaction of Davide Tardozzi to the fact that Ducati had just wrapped up the manufacturers' championship at Aragon. You could see that it doesn't matter. I mean, yes, it's nice. It's one of those things which is really nice if you can manage it. But the thing that really, really matters is the Riders' Championship. And yet Ducati keep on finding a way to not win the Riders' Championship. They've had a little bit of bad luck because also they've been up against, once they lost Casey Stoner, they were up against Casey Stoner on a Honda, and then Jorge Lorenzo Valentino Rossi on a Yamaha. On a Ducati which wasn't very good, and then they had a Ducati which was very good, but Andrea Dovizioso was going up against Marc Marquez. They should have got it done in 2020 or 2021, but Fabio Quartararo was just phenomenal last year. The Yamaha is completely outclassed by the Ducati in every single respect this year, and yet they still can't do it. They still cannot win a championship. The Bagnaia, it was a stupid mistake by Bagnaia, the crash. Again, it was one of those things he said afterwards. I mean, he held his hand up. He was very honest, really good. Like the thing that he said was it was an idiotic maneuver. But he was thinking on that last lap to not only about passing Quartararo, which would have sort of cut the gap by 2 points. But also he was then sort of thinking about, okay, right, if I get past Quartararo, maybe I can have a go at Vinales. And that to me was you've got to focus on the job in hand. You're so on the limit at every single moment. You can't be thinking sort of two or three things ahead. You can't be thinking about passing Vinales when you're not yet past Quartararo. First, you have to get past Quartararo. And I think it was a lapse of concentration. Threw away a lot of points. And it just seems that Ducati are doomed. I think perhaps it's also because we've got 8 bikes on the grid. Like they've got 8 bikes on the grid. They've got so many really strong riders. Zarco, Martin, Miller, even Luca Marini is starting to come really, really good. Bezzecchi is looking fantastic. But that can be a disadvantage because you're not focusing all of your efforts on just one person and putting the pressure on that one rider, because and that's where they seem to be coming up short.
It was interesting when Pecco was talking about what you just mentioned there, Dave, about wanting to try and overtake Vinales as well. You almost wonder the fact that he was thinking too far ahead meant that the job at hand, which was beating Quartararo, just maybe didn't take the precedence that it needed at that point in the race. And you think back to his crashes in Germany, you think back to his crash in Le Mans. That was when he had just been passed by a faster rider and he was settling into a rhythm and thinking about, okay, I'm going to follow this guy and then attack later on. And again, maybe just the focus wasn't absolutely what it needed to be at that moment, at that corner where he eventually crashed out. So you have to look at this as a real weakness. I mean, Pecco has been so good in the second half of the season. The 4-race winning run was brilliant, and at that point I was really thinking this guy doesn't really have many flaws. But I think what we did see in Motegi were a couple of his weaknesses on show. You mentioned it earlier, Dave, how it takes him longer to get up to speed over a weekend, and I think that's understandable. He's 25 years old. This is his 4th year in MotoGP, so he's still not the absolute finished article. But these are kind of things that Fabio Quartararo doesn't suffer from, and maybe that is related somewhat to the package that Fabio's on. But you can see from the very first session, Fabio is immediately on the pace. Marquez is the same. It doesn't take him any time whatsoever to get up to speed. And Pecco, it just takes a couple of sessions through the weekend. And if that's disrupted, then it can be a real sticking point for him. And you do have to look at the races coming up and think, well, yes, he does have experience in Thailand and Phillip Island on a MotoGP machine, but it hasn't been in 3 years. And those are 2 tracks that are notorious for having intermittent weather conditions, and perhaps those are 2 more occasions where he might suffer from a similar type of thing, where he just comes to the race and he isn't ready. He hasn't got his setting dialed in, he hasn't got his feeling dialed in, and eventually that could be, I mean, if he has 2 more bad races, that could be the championship over by the time we get to Sepang. So yes, it was interesting. I think it was a very revealing weekend, because, as I said 2 races ago, I thought this guy is unbeatable. He could win the rest of the races all the way to Valencia. But yeah, there was a few more little flaws that we were made aware of in Japan.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well. You mentioned about the experience he has at those tracks. He's got bad experience at those tracks as well. Whereas Fabio has had that good running. Pecco didn't have that. Pecco was struggling as a rookie. And I think it's one of those things that for Fabio, that's going to give him more momentum. The mistake, like you said, Dave, Pecco holds his hands up and then sarcastically claps his way through the gravel trap, making fun of himself. And it'll be interesting to see how he deals with that going into the next couple of rounds. The championship is still in his hands. He's 18 points behind. If he wins the races, he wins the championship. But he needs to make sure that he's in a position to do that. And this was a situation, I always like the American expression of some people are playing checkers, some people are playing chess. He was trying to play chess and he needed to just play checkers. He needed to be simple and not think about anything other than, is it worth the risk to try and overtake Pecco? It wasn't, to overtake Fabio. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. It certainly wasn't worth it to be thinking about Maverick at that stage. As it is, 18 points. It's a very much advantage Fabio now.
After he crashed out at Sachsenring, he said he went home and sort of thought about it for a couple of days and figured it out. I mean, we were talking about this earlier about needing time to sort of figure it out. And what he figured out was you just have to concentrate on the one thing. Don't concentrate on too many things. And it really feels like he just slipped back to that old mistake of thinking about too many things, thinking not just about trying to pass Fabio, but also trying to pass Maverick. And the other thing that he said was he didn't have any rear grip, so he couldn't actually use the advantage of the Ducati. He was really strong in braking, but he didn't have any rear grip, so he didn't have any drive grip, he didn't have any acceleration, so he wasn't making up any ground out of corners, which is what he would have normally have done. Make up ground on corners, so that you're arriving at a point where you can outbrake someone easily. He was just never close enough.
I think that was his 5th DNF of the season. 4 of those have been due to rider errors. He was taken out by Taki Nakagami in Barcelona, so that wasn't his fault. And he scored a 15th place in the rain in Indonesia. And I think another thing that is quite critical this weekend is that he said this year he just has absolutely no confidence, no feeling whatsoever in the wet. And I mean, that could be a real hindrance. I think you were saying when we did the note show yesterday, Dave, weather could well be quite shaky for Thailand this weekend. So
Phillip Island. I mean,
Phillip Island.
Phillip Island is notorious for having fantastically stable weather throughout the weekend.
And Malaysia as well.
Yeah, Malaysia as well. Yeah, absolutely.
So this could also be a thing. We used to talk about Yamaha and Fabio having serious issues in the wet, and they're certainly not the most competitive package in wet conditions. But I mean, Pecco said on Saturday, had he not previously qualified for Q2 due to a fast time at the end of Friday's session, he would have qualified probably in the back row of the grid. Like, that's how slow he was. So another thing that I think could be a real limiting factor for his championship hopes in the weeks to come.
Yeah, I think that's all very fair, and I think the big thing is going to be what Ducati decides to as well. And Dave, you've mentioned Sepang Clack, and they brought up Ducati and their inability to win world championships. That's 2 boxes ticked off. I'm going to tick off the 3rd box by saying that my big talking point of the weekend was that we got full-on confirmation of just what we're going to get from Mark going forward. I've said a lot over the last few years that as it was with all the injuries, we were going to see it that Mark was just another rider for quite a lot of the time in the season. And then we go to Coda or Saxon Ring or places he's always been really strong, and he'd still be Marc Marquez. I was wrong. The surgery this year has solved the issues, and Mark is back to being Mark. Now, whether that's enough to win a world championship on a Honda remains to be seen, but Mark's the best we've ever seen, and I'm not doubting him at all. Once he's got a functioning body, he's still the best in the world.
Yeah, the interesting thing was this was the first time that he'd done more than about 6 or 7 laps in a row. The race, he wasn't sure what it was going to be like, and by the end he said, "Look, sure, my arm was tired, but there was no pain. It wasn't. There wasn't any. It wasn't hurting. It's just that he was lacking strength, which was also interesting because I think if it was, I can't remember if it was Friday or Saturday that he said, he'd been by the end of it, he was starting to put his arm into sort of the wrong positions again because he was just too tired to do it properly. And that was when his bone was starting to hurt again. So his arm isn't completely healed, but I think he took so much confidence from this that he's going to be really, really, he's going to be really terrifying for the next. I mean, absolutely for next year, but also for the rest of the rest of the season. He's going to be a factor. He's going to start to become a factor up front in the races because he can race. He can last until the end of the race. And we've got some tracks coming up where Mark can be pretty darn good.
Yeah, he's won the 2 races that we've had in Thailand so far. He loves Phillip Island. He's had some of his best ever races at Phillip Island, certainly in 2015. We have to mention that again, don't we? That critical race in which he, basically tried to spoil the championship, the little so-and-so.
Spoiling the championship by taking 5 points from Jorge Lorenzo by beating him, which is a completely mysterious.
But he slowed up the race at the front, Dave. He slowed up the race at the front.
That's right. Yeah, like I say, it's all Andrea Iannoni's fault, but I won't go into it.
Yeah. And then Valencia as well. I mean, he's just fantastic around Valencia. Obviously, Phillip Island, Valencia, anti-clockwise circuits, which should be easier for him because he's obviously suffering with the upper right arm injury. And I think it was a really a performance that he can take a lot from on Sunday because he passed Miguel Oliveira for 4th with a beautiful move. I think 3 laps from the flag. He was strong right at the end. Those guys were under severe pressure from Luca Marini, but he held on. And also he was one of the few on the soft rear tire. And I think we could say with some confidence that the hard rear tire was the tire to go with. Obviously, the first 2 guys in the race went with that option. And Mark was still competitive up towards the end. So I think there's a huge amount of confidence he can take from this performance. From this weekend as a whole, he saw again how fast he was in the rain. And I just think like the energy that he's showing must just be such a massive motivation to Honda. You know, he's just such a driving force. Obviously, he's nowhere near fully fit on the bike, but the fact that he's back here taking risks, having the occasional crash, putting it all on the line, you know, that just must tell Honda that, right, we really have to raise our game to do what it takes to get this guy feeling comfortable and competitive again. And you think about the funk that Honda was in when Mark was away. He said that he came and observed the factory box and the LCR box during the Austrian and the San Marino GPs, and he just said everyone was just sick, basically sick of saying the same things, same issues that they're having problems with. And the fact that he's come back with this determination, right, we're building towards 2023. I mean, there's just such a fresh energy in there now. And yeah, as Dave said, I mean, I don't think it's just ominous for 2023. I think it's actually ominous for the last 4 races of this year. I would not be surprised to see Mark win by the end of the year.
I think this is also the difference between. This is also perhaps why Ducati can't win a championship, because Pecco Bagnaia is an incredibly talented rider. He's incredibly fast. He's a nice guy, but he doesn't have that same force of personality to lead a team. Mark is a leader. Mark is a born leader. I mean, like, he leads his team. He leads Honda. He sets the direction. He sets the emotion in the garage. Valentino Rossi was absolutely the same. He came in and he led his men and women. You know, he led his team into a win. Lorenzo, even though Lorenzo's personality was very different to Valentino Rossi's, he was a very strong personality and led. Fabio Quartararo was the same. Fabio Quartararo hit that trio of Fabio, his crew chief, and his beta guy, and Tom, his assistant. That is such a strong core that it gives Yamaha an incredible direction. You know, there's a real sense of leadership, and yeah, I mean, like, Mark has basically picked Honda up by the scruff of their neck and sort of thrown them into next year. So I'm really looking forward to next year, because the Yamaha is going to be so much better, and we're going to have we can have a fit, healthy, and fast Marquez on a Honda, which will still be a bad bike, but it won't be as terrible as this year.
How much of a factor do you guys think it is then? Like, when you look at the names you've mentioned there, Dave, whether it's Rossi, Marquez, Lorenzo, whoever you want to look at, Casey, you could put into that mix as well. They were all their own men as boys coming up through the ranks, whether it was in the European 125 Championship for Rossi or the Spanish Championship for the other guys. They came to the 125s or 250 Grand Prix class for Stoner as riders that had been earmarked to something special. They were guys that went in and they had that force of personality as 15-year-olds to really be the center of attention. Marquez just generated that at KTM the instant he came there, really, it seemed. Then he has the Monlau team built around him for Moto2, goes to Repsol Honda, tries to bring his crew with him, is told, no, they can't come this year, you have to use who we have. And he has the bravery to say, right, when I win the championship, you're bringing all my boys in. And he had that sense of purpose from a very early age. Pecco's been in the VR46 Academy. You're always overshadowed by Rossi. Even now, it's still one of the things that's mentioned for all the VR46 guys that have either come through or are still part of that, you know, they've got all the support they need. They're out in Tavolia on the ranch every couple of days. They're testing at Misano, but they're still doing all these with Rossi. There's still that, you know, it's almost like the parent overshadowing the child. So you can look at, you know, a father and son racing duo. We still talk about Wayne Gardner when Remy's being mentioned at times. That seems to be one of the things that the VR46 Academy gives you a head start, but it can also put you where you've probably had a little bit too much handed to you in some ways.
That's a really good point. I do think that if you like, almost the leader of the VR46 team is still Valentino Rossi, you know, and that can be a bit of a disadvantage. And it's going to be really interesting to see an Enea Bastianini in Ducati next year, because he isn't part of the VR46 entourage. He is very much his own person, and can he be that really strong leader that can, you know, force a direction for Ducati and actually make a difference?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to be that leader now. We're moving on to the next topic, boys. And that's just how it's going to be. Let's get to winners and losers right now. We're going to kick it off with Adam coming back in from the shopping centre over in Chicago.
The winner for me has to be Fabio. He came out of what was a tough race with an increase in his championship lead, and of course was a whisker away from being taken out, I think for the third race in the second half of this season by Bagnaia. When Bagnaia was kind of rolling through the gravel and then picked himself up and started clapping, rather sort of ironically at his own mistake, I think he was probably as well giving some praise to Fabio, because he knows that was a major misstep in the championship, and I think the Yamaha's only going to be competitive. I mean, Quartararo says he likes the track in Buriram. We know he's going to be fast at Sepang and also Phillip Island, so that was a big chance for Bagnaia just to at least stay in the hunt, and he messed it up. So even though I'm talking about Fabio as being the winner, Bagnaia also dropped the ball big time. So again, Yamaha came out of that, I think, it was a tough weekend up to that point in the good. 2 crashes for Aaron Canet. He's my loser from the Moto Grand Prix of Japan. It was fairly obvious. I mean, he looked like being in a position where he would finally get that first win in Moto2, and it didn't go to plan. There was also the story, Dave, which you put on your Twitter. A colleague of ours, Mela Cherkeles, got something of a scoop, if you want to call it that, on the reason why Canet's been wearing this bow tie, and just how the perception of him wearing all this body ink seems to be putting off some sponsors or teams, maybe from inquiring after his services. I mean, maybe it isn't just that. Maybe it's some of his sort of reckless actions in Moto3. Maybe just how Aaron is as a person as well, not just the superficial tattoos. But it is a little sad if people are prejudging him. But Canet, I think, on the track showed that he still isn't quite the finished article. Undoubtedly very fast, but still to grab that first win, and he was in a great position to do it. On the subject of losers, I would also like to offer a quick apology, because on the last podcast last week, I was a little bit offensive to some of our colleagues over the whole Augusto Fernandez thing. My point was merely I was trying to justify the actions of one of our photographer friends, Polarity Photo, trying to get his work done. I mean, obviously, if you want to do something in confidence, don't do it in public. But I think sometimes there's a little bit of an understanding between media colleagues about something that's being done for not that particular time. Anyway, just to close the book on it, I was probably a little bit too gobby. So apologies. Hoping to join you on the podcast next week. Thanks, guys.
Thanks again, Adam. Some interesting ones there, Fabio Quartararo and Aaron Canet. And I think for Aaron, just such a shame. The bow tie is going to be gone, Neil. Are you going to be able to deal with the disappointment of not having that grand reveal for the bow tie?
Yeah, I don't know if I am, Steve, to be honest, because that was something I'd been building myself up toward for years now. I thought there was going to be some sort of, I don't know, like a ticker tape shower followed down upon Parc Fermé, and I don't know, big letters spelling out exactly what the meaning of it all was. A glorious
3D holograms and the whole sort of like a
dance routine as well.
Yeah. Obviously, brass band.
Yes, exactly. Probably helicopter. Spelling something out in the sky as well, or So skydivers, the whole thing sort of. Yeah, that's right. Each with a different letter on their parachute. Or
I have to say, there's a part of me that was really hoping that when the bow tie secret was revealed, that Crayfar wouldn't ask anything about it then in Parc Fermé. It would just be, let's talk about the race. But as it was, I've been disappointed. There was also part of me that was thinking, you know what, Canet has obviously said that the MotoGP teams aren't that interested in him. There's a lot of teams in the Superbike paddock that are very interested in him. He's one of the riders that in that paddock, a lot of people look at as being, you know what, when we look at Dominic Aguilar or Locatelli, all these riders that come across, Canet's had so much success. He's a rider that really could make a big impact over in the Superbike class. And I think it's going to be interesting to see which riders tend to make that transition in the next few years. Jorge Navarro looks like he's going to move over to Supersport next year. And he's just following that recent trend.
But he can't get the job done, Steve. Why can't he get the job done? I mean, there's been 6 first-time winners in Moto2 this year, and he still isn't one of them. And he's had so many opportunities now. I just don't understand what happened in the race on Sunday. It was he had like over a second and a half of advantage. He didn't need to be pushing that hard, and it was just another one of those races like we had in Kota earlier this year, where he was the fastest guy. Take a deep breath. You've got a second and a half of track behind you to the next rider. Firmino Alguerra just crashed out a second. Take your time, mate. Relax, breathe. But yeah, he can't get it over the line, and that's it's a big feeling at the moment for him.
That's because of the bow tie. I mean, the problem was the bow tie. He had this whole thing about, I've got this whole thing. Once again, it's about thinking beyond the end of the race. He's not thinking about the race. He's thinking about, like, if I finally win this race, then I'll be able to tell this story. Because it's quite, it's quite a sad and upsetting story, the fact that he's being discriminated against because of his full body tattoos. Like, tattoos are not my thing, but his are actually really well done. It is a complete whole. And also I love the fact that, the way that it integrates with his helmet is seriously cool. His tash, on the other hand, is an absolute crime and shouldn't be allowed. But that's completely different. Again, I think it's a class thing. I also think he's not being given a chance because of all these tattoos. And I think he would fit in better in the World Superbike paddock, because the World Superbike paddock is a little bit more working class. It's a little bit less middle class, and I think it could be more of an asset to. He could be more of an asset to them. His tattoos could be more of an asset because again, it's a bit of something extra, a bit like Toprak and his stoppies. It gives something extra. So yeah, I think it's a really great move.
I think Kinnett is an interesting one. When you speak to him in English, and I can totally relate to this, I don't think you get the real Aaron Kinnett. His English is obviously pretty good. It's passable. He can explain himself well, but you don't get any of the kind of humor that he shows when he's speaking in Spanish. Also, he's really sincere. This is a guy that was talking to DAZN, the Spanish TV broadcaster, recently about some of the eating disorder or traits of eating disorders that he was showing when he was in Moto3, because he was so obsessed with his weight and keeping his weight just on point so he could be competitive in that class. That's a very interesting, slightly worrying topic to be discussing. And it is something that, let's face it, Moto3 riders think about a lot, and maybe in some cases way too much. Again, this is a good story. I think it's we were joking for a long time that it was going to be some crass or silly reason, but actually there was a decent story behind it. But a shame that we had to hear about it after he had binned it out of the lead, rather than in Parc Fermé with the ticker tape falling and the banner being pulled across the sky by the plane that he'd hired.
But he's going to win Thailand now. Basically, he's thrown that away. He's discarded it. He's forgotten about it, and now he can actually get on a race, and you'll see he'll win Thailand by about 17 seconds.
You mean Bow Thailand?
Oh, Neil.
Oh, Neil. I tell you what, you better use that in one of your headlines for after Thailand whenever he does win. But I will say one thing about I would love to see him come to the Superbike paddock. It could be 2024. Which coincidentally is also the same time when Andrea Iannone is available for riding again. And certainly Iannone is going to be in play in the Superbike paddock if he wants to continue his riding career, because how could you not? How could you not want him? He's going to be,
because he's not been competing for over 3 years.
Doesn't matter.
You're going to get one of the most talented riders in the world for absolute nothing. You offer him 50 grand a year in big bonuses, and you've got one of the best riders that Ducati staked their future on before Argentina and the clash with Dobby. So again, there's another thing we can tick off the list about Ducati and team battles. But it's been a very successful podcast in that regard. But I think it's one of those things that these riders are going to get opportunities to still race at the front, win a lot of races, be very competitive. That's what the Superbike paddock is doing right now, because there's too many good riders. There's too many riders getting disregarded very early in their careers because there's the next young guy coming through. And Neil, that kind of brings us pretty neatly to your big winner from the weekend, I think.
Yes, Agura was my big winner from the weekend, where Cannock Field, Agura succeeded. It wasn't looking too rosy for him on Saturday after he qualified down in 13th, but a bit like Ethan Guevara in the Moto3 race, he just had a great start and really got stuck in. was making overtakes left, right, and centre in the first couple of laps. After Canet crashed out, he was among the leading group. And I thought it was just a brilliant ride, because not only did he make that early comeback, but then when he hit the front, Augusto Fernandez, who was the fastest man at track, got into second, and there was just over a second between the pair of them. This is obviously the top two in the championship. This had huge implications for the championship fight. And Augusto put in a couple of fastest laps, but Agura just lowered his pace and matched them and did not put a foot wrong. So I thought it was a really composed and aggressive ride from Agura. He's maybe not a guy you associate with being super aggressive, but I think he showed pretty much everything in this race. And of course, in front of his home fans as well, extra pressure there from both the home support from Honda, and he kind of pulled this performance out of the hat. And the first Japanese winner on home soil since his team boss Hiroshi Yama did so in 2006. Honda president was there watching. I mean, yeah, talk about making yourself the golden boy of the factory for future years with a performance like that. So yeah, Agura I thought was brilliant.
And he's 2 points behind Augusto Fernandez in the championship now as well. So that's really tied up as well. As the Moto2 championship is really tight.
Yeah, I was actually just going to say as well, I thought that from Augusto, it was actually a really good performance, because he looked like he was absolutely nowhere, and then he was just slowly able to pick his way through and manage to still come away with good points, hold on to the championship lead, move on to the next couple of rounds and see what comes from that. But I thought it was, again, like what we talked about after Aragon, it was a really interesting Moto2 race. But Dave, what about you? Who was your big winner?
I think my big winner this weekend was Brad Binder, because he showed that he's such a good rider. He's just exceptional. There were a lot of riders giving him sort of a lot of praise for what he's capable of doing. And if you, it's clear the KTM only works in certain circumstances. It's still a very flawed motorcycle. Miguel Oliveira had a good race as well, but it was genuinely Brad Binder making the difference, getting the front row start, and then coming through. The pass that he put on Martin at the end of the race was just outstanding. It really makes you wonder what he'd be capable of doing on a good bike. He's clearly, I think he could be one of that elite group of Marquez and Quartararo. I would probably put him maybe third to that group, and it'd be great to actually see him if he was on a really competitive bike. Like if I was Ducati, I would have signed him up a long time ago. But he's there with KTM.
Yeah, how he's sixth in the championship this year on that bike is remarkable, and just testament to Brad's talents. Just a guy that just puts absolutely everything into it every time he's out on track. And obviously that has won the total admiration of the KTM bosses. And, I think he's one of those guys that could have a place with them for life if he wanted it. But, it just depends on whether they can build a good enough bike for him to go fast on next year and in 2024.
And again, as we were saying before, he's a leader. He's a natural leader. Like he's in the garage with his team. When he comes into the team, he shakes everyone's hand. He says hello. He leads that team. He really leads that team. So he's like, when he has something positive to say, he's always positive about the bike. He criticizes the bike as well, but because he leads that team, he can make those criticisms and get heard.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that when you look at how his last few years have progressed, I think the lesson that he learned from Ayo in the Moto2 class showed why he was a perfect rider for Ayo and why his brother Darren wasn't a perfect rider for Ayo. And I think it's always interesting to see how different teams take out the best in different riders, and others it just doesn't quite work for them. And it certainly works for Binder with KTM. But for me, my big winner from the weekend was the race winner in the Premier class, Jack Miller, because it showed all the hard work that he's been able to put in over the last few years. He's well rewarded for it. Obviously, there's an expectation as the factory Ducati rider, you're going to be winning a lot of races. His job hasn't been to do that over the course of the second half of this year. It's been to make progress. And on a weekend like this, where Bagnaia's had his struggles, you've got to be in position to pick off the riders in front of you. Miller did that. When he dropped down to sixth on the second lap or the first lap, you're thinking, you know what, this is going to be really tough. He's got good riders in front of him. It's been a tough qualifying session to be on the third row of the grid, but he just made his progress. And then once he get the front, there was no one was going to get close to him. And I thought it was really impressive that he said afterwards it was the best race of his career. It's very difficult to see how he could have had any race that was better than that. But for me, Jack Miller was my big winner. But obviously, we've heard from Adam about who his loser of the weekend was with Aaron Canet. But Dave, what about you? Who was your loser?
Well, my loser is coming back to my my sort of main talking point really. I mean, my loser of this weekend losers are Gigi Dall'Igna, Davide Tardozzi, Paolo Ciabatti. They put together an organisation which is dominant. They have created a bike which is the best on the grid. They have the biggest collection of talent available to them. They've won so many races this year. They watched, they had 2 bikes on the podium. They had Jack Miller winning, and yet they cannot win a Riders' Championship. And this was yet another example of why they cannot win a championship. And Gigi Dall'Igna, I mean, I think we've all said this over the years. Gigi Dall'Igna was brought in to win the Riders' Championship, and he hasn't done it yet. He just hasn't delivered, even though he has clearly built the best bike on the bit. I mean, there is the Ducati is so much better than everyone at everything, and yet they cannot win a Riders' Championship.
Neil, what about you? Who was your big loser from the weekend?
It's a name that's cropped up in this section quite often this year, Steve, but Franco Morbidelli for me is the big loser. And I say that because, yes, he finished ahead of Cal Crutchlow in the race. He was 14th, Crutchlow was 15th. But actually, I was listening back to Cal's comments this morning, and he had a pretty good weekend, if you look at it. He had a rubbish qualifying. He had a warning, I think, light on his dashboard coming up to the grid, saying that his front tire pressure was too low. Then he forgot to engage his whole shot device. So he got a pretty bad start, had to come through. And obviously the Yamaha is a difficult bike to overtake on. Every rider he came up to pass, it took him 3 laps to overtake them. And once he got to Morbidelli, or just behind Morbidelli, if you actually look at his rhythm, he was doing a rhythm at that point in the race that was similar to what Jack Miller was doing. Crutchlow said he had the pace pretty much to finish P8, which I think for a rider coming back from retirement for the second time is impressive. And why am I talking about Crutchlow so much? Because this is only his second race this season on that bike. He had 5 tests, I think, before the Aragon race this year, and he is making Franco Morbidelli look a bit silly. And I think that's worrying. There were signs of Franco recovering his mojo and getting back on the pace. Austria, San Marino, but Aragon and Japan once again have shown that he's not really there. And if someone like Crutchlow's coming in, a guy who has recently had 5-6 years experience with Honda, has been retired essentially for 2 years with the exception of a couple of substitute rides. Obviously, he's a test rider now, so he's still on the bike occasionally. But if he's coming in and showing up a full-time rider, apparently this is a bike that only one rider can ride. Well, Crutchlow's showing that even though he's not very naturally suited to the Yamaha, he can still maybe get top 10 finishes. And Morbidelli has not been capable of doing that all year. So, I have to say, Franco, again, Cal is, pains me to say it, but, Cal's kind of showing him up.
Also, Cal's got a completely destroyed shoulder, which and he's still managing to do that. An interesting point. I was talking earlier about comparing times from 2019 2020. Fabio Quartararo was just under 3 seconds faster than he was in 2019 this year. Morbidelli was 2.5 seconds faster. So it's not as if Morbidelli has sort of gone backwards or anything. It's just that he was a long way off in 2019. He's a long way off in 2022 as well.
Yeah, I think that's all fair enough. I think for me, my big loser, for reasons we talked about earlier on, was Aleix and Aprilia, because this was an open goal for them this weekend, and instead now they're really up against it for the championship. They're going to be looking over their shoulder for finishing third in the world as well with Bastianini. So for that reason, I've gone with Aleix. We're going to take a quick break in the Paddock Pass podcast. When we come back after the break, we're going to have a quick look ahead to the Thai Grand Prix. Welcome back to the Paddock Pass podcast. We've got a couple of minutes left on the show just to look ahead to this weekend's Thai Grand Prix. And this is a nice, easy one for me, Neil, because it's just the Thai Grand Prix for the sponsor. So this wasn't one that was particularly difficult for me to manage. Even for the Paddock Pass podcast, Paddock Notes show during the course of the weekend, I'm sure we'll manage that all right. So if everyone checks out patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast, you'll be able to sign up for the notes so to get the full update from the weekend in Thailand. As it is, we're just going to be very quick at the end of today's show just to look at what we're expecting for it. And Neil, the weather, you've already mentioned it on the show earlier, that this could be one of the big factors this weekend.
It could be, Steve. Yeah, I think rain is forecast right the way through the weekend. So, that could lead to a bit of a topsy-turvy grid like we saw at Motegi. It could also disrupt the kind of working rhythms of certain riders. So yes, it's tough to know what to make of it. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see some of the runners that we saw strong at Motegi fast again this weekend. The likes of Miller, maybe Marquez. Fabio is a big question mark for me. I mean, it's that old adage: if he can qualify well, it could be great. I think there should be more overtaking opportunities for him at Buriram than there were at Motegi, because at Motegi, most of the braking markers were pretty much where at the end of long straights, which start off with slow acceleration points, there are two very long straights. Well, I guess three start and finish straight as well. Three very long straights in Thailand with lot of low acceleration, accelerating points basically leading onto them. So you kind of feel that Fabio is going to lose ground in the first half of the lap and then ride like absolute hell in the second part to try and make up ground. Maybe he can get close enough to whoever's ahead into the last corner to make an overtake there. So I think that's going to be interesting to see just how strong he is. The Aprilia as well. You have to imagine that the Aprilia will be looking pretty good in that final half lap. So I think it's going to be interesting, Steve. I think it's going to be pretty wide open. We've had two great MotoGP races the two times we've been at Buriram. Hopefully we'll have another on Sunday.
Yeah, I've always loved going to Buriram as well. When we went for World Superbikes, I think I went there 3 times, and I always thought it was quite cool. You land, you have to get to the other airport, get to the center of Thailand, and the weather conditions always play a factor, whether it's because of the heat, the humidity, the rain you can get this time of year. All those things are going to be a factor. Dave, is Marc Marquez going to be a factor? We've already talked about him and how we expect him to win a race again this season. But what about this weekend?
I mean, on paper, this should be quite a difficult race for him because there's a lot of hard braking into right-hand corners, which is, where he's weakest. But then, that was the same for Motegi. So we should see he has won the last 2 races. It's going to be very interesting to see the state of the track. Because MotoGP hasn't been there for whatever it is, 3 years. I have literally no idea how much action there's been on the track. That's likely the track will be very green. Michelin will be bringing slightly revised compounds. We also get the special tire that we had in Austria as well, which I think is also the one tire which the Aprilias don't get on with, so that's going to be difficult. It's the special carcass because of the high speed, like high speed, hard acceleration, lots of hard braking. I think it's fairly heavy on fuel again, so again that is not going to play into the hands of the Ducati. That's going to help make it a little bit easier for the Yamaha, but the Yamaha is really going to suffer in terms of acceleration and top speed. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be another one of these really mixed up races where it's going to be very hard to say very much about it unless we do get a lot of dry running. And looking at the weather forecast, it looks like there's going to be lots of little bits of disruption, and the race itself might be a wet race, and then if it's a wet race, then it could be really bad news for Pecco Bagnaia. And yeah, Genuinely, it's going to be very interesting. I don't think we can draw very many conclusions about it.
Yeah, Buriram does traditionally get quite a bit of running with Thai Superbike Championship, the Asia Road Racing Championship, but obviously with COVID, a lot of those were cancelled. So it will be interesting to see what state the track's in. It's also going to be very interesting for us to see what state Neil's in on Thursday afternoon whenever he dials in for the Paddock Notes show. But we're excited to see how that is, Neil. I'm sure everyone's excited to listen to that as well. So like I said earlier, patreon.com/Paddock Pass Podcast, and you can get yourself signed up for all the updates through the weekend. And we'll obviously have Adam back on the show next week. And make sure if you've got any questions ahead of this weekend, get them into @Paddock Pass Pod on Twitter, or at Neil, David, or Adam, or myself, and you'll be able to get the full updates all the way through the weekend, what you need to know.
Yeah, we'll even add a disclaimer to the podcast. What you see from my part in Thailand will not be pretty.
At least you've had
that is going to be very important for the YouTube channel, and you can check out on YouTube the Paddock Pass Podcast. After each MotoGP weekend, we try and do a video podcast as well, so check that out as well to be able to keep yourself up to date, as it is from myself, David, Neil, Adam, dialing in from a shopping centre in Chicago. Big thank you to everyone for listening to this show, and a big thank you to Fly Racing and Renthal Street for supporting the podcast.